Welcome back to our conference. Our second session is going to begin here. I know a couple others may be wandering in, but let me invite forward again Dr. Carlson. After his second talk here, we're going to have plenty of time for Q&A, so make notes or make mental notes if you have any questions for him. With that, without further ado, welcome back.
In this second session, I seek to present Martin Luther's views on sex, marriage, and family in a manner that speaks to the issues of our time, 500 years later. My theses are in number 3, not 95. First, I hold that Martin Luther crafted a unique and remarkably contemporary ethic regarding family, marriage, and sexuality. Second, I maintain that while firmly grounded in Scripture, Luther's social ethic was forward-looking, even revolutionary in content. And third, I argue that this social ethic still bears a powerful and relevant message for Christians and others in the 21st century. In key respects, of course, Luther's theology of the family emerged in reaction to the circumstances of his time. The strong family ethic of the early Christians was then in a period of trouble, of crisis. In the early years of the 16th century in Europe, the Christian church, again centered in Rome, claimed an astonishing 25% of the adult population in celibate orders. 1 of every 4 adults served as a priest or resided in a convent or a monastery, complete with vows of chastity. Over the centuries, religious orders had accumulated through bequests on the death of prominent people, large, sometimes even vast estates, and gathered in the wealth that came through this ownership of productive land. Life in a wealthy and spiritually lazy monastery could be easy. The Knights of the Teutonic Order, to choose a special German example, had been transformed during the medieval era from a crusading army spreading the faith into a wealthy military, commercial, political complex. With vast resources, its members, too, took vows of celibacy. All the same, there were mounting complaints over the failure of many in the church and holy orders to keep their vows. Indeed, sexual scandals of a sort rocked Western Christendom in the 15th and early 16th centuries. So-called papal nephews, the illegitimate children of clergymen who went on to become popes, were one manifestation. And it appears that the keeping of concubines, of mistresses by bishops, was no longer rare. The great Christian humanist Desiderius Erasmus of Rotterdam was himself the illegitimate son of a man who later became a priest. Ordained on his own in 1492, Erasmus, while never breaking with Rome, was sharp in his criticism of abuses within the church. He pointed especially to the widespread sexual disorders of his day. Quote, "Let them talk as they will of the status of monks and virgins. Those who under the pretext of celibacy live in sexual license might better be castrated. There is a horde of priests among whom chastity is rare." Some whispered that the sins of Sodom had taken root among the Teutonic Knights and in certain other monastic orders. Certainly at the 1522 Imperial Diet or Council held at Nuremberg, lay Christians placed before the Pope and Emperor a long list of complaints about priests maintaining concubines, a sin absolved through a standard payment to one's bishop, the cleric's drunkenness, quarreling, and tavern hunting, church trafficking and forgiveness for offenses such as incest and bigamy, and priestly sexual encounters with the women of their parishes. As Philip of Burgundy, great uncle of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, and himself the Bishop of Utrecht, as he explained, chastity was nearly impossible among clerics who were pampered with high living and tempted by indolence. These abuses and problems festered until the Roman Catholic Church convened the Council of Trent in 1545. In addition, the late medieval church held arguably conflicting views of women. Formally, the Virgin Mary stood as a model of devotion, honor, and emulation. Informally, though, there were also signs of a certain misogyny, a curious distrust of women, complemented by an emphasis on their supposed inferior nature. This sentiment was well captured in a phrase attributed to St. Jerome: "If you find things going too well, take a wife." Regarding marriage, the late medieval church held two somewhat inconsistent views. On the one hand, it considered marriage to be a Christian sacrament, a divine mystery, a channel of God's sanctifying grace. On the other hand, it projected the message that the spiritual status of a celibate priest, monk, or nun was superior to that of a married lay Christian. Canon law did cast marriage as an obstacle to a life of prayer and wholehearted fellowship with God. Children kept getting in the way. To enter marriage and to bear and rear children were left as somewhat inferior Christian acts, somewhat less than holy. The sexual act itself, even in marriage, stood as unclean and degrading. Marriage did enjoy a high degree of regulation by the church. Generally, governments were not involved. While divorce was prohibited, church marriage courts dealt with the issues of annulment. Annulment being where a marriage would be declared illicit and wrong because of something that happened back when the marriage took place, a mistake was made. And with the inevitable disputes. The problems within this church-grounded regulatory system were accumulating. To begin with, the late medieval church maintained a long list of impediments to marriage, most of which could be overcome with a payment into the right episcopal cash box. Accordingly, cynicism over the institution of marriage grew. In addition, the church held to the doctrine of secret marriage. Even if no witnesses were present, a couple would be considered married if they had exchanged private vows and then joined in sexual union. For obvious reasons, this practice generated innumerable disputes, as one party to the event, commonly the male seducer, would deny that vows had ever been shared. Martin Luther's approach to marriage, family, and sexuality cut through this world as a hot knife through butter. While appearing at times to be astonishingly modern, even scientific in his insights, Luther ultimately built his arguments on his reading of Scripture. As he told the Teutonic Knights in urging them to abandon celibacy in favor of marriage, "Close eyes and ears, and simply lay hold of God's word in your hearts." Luther, let us remember, was himself an Augustinian monk and priest, and a prominent professor of theology at the University of Wittenberg. His new family ethic emerged during the years 1519 to 1523 and exhibited certain traits to be expected in the work of a transitional figure. There were, for example, traditional elements in Luther's approval of the corporal punishment of children, and his occasional use of the word family to mean a household, also including servants, maids, and beasts. Yet the principal and historically significant thrust of Luther's thought lay in 5 impulses, which defined a unique evangelical interpretation of family life. The first of these was Luther's prophetic posture, born out of his outrage over the immorality and social irresponsibility that he saw as tolerated by church leaders. Quote, "Take away those seducers, the priests and monks, who have disgraced our mothers, wives, daughters, and sisters, and made harlots of them." This he wrote in his exposition of Psalm 127. Addressing the Knights of the Teutonic Order, Luther boldly noted that the knights are suspected and disliked because everyone knows how rare chastity is among them, and every man must be afraid for his wife and daughter. With a vivid sense of right and wrong framed by the 10 Commandments, Luther condemned what he called the smart immaturity of clerics who avoided marriage and sought to lure young people away from it into unchristian and immoral ways of life. Luther warned specifically about the dangers posed by unmarried adult men. And I quote here, "Single men cannot be trusted very far. Even married men have all they can do to keep from falling into adultery, although among them there is more justification for hope and confidence. With single men, one can have neither hope nor confidence, but only constant fear." Luther's revulsion against the sexual disorders of his age also led him to advocate strong civil legislation to punish sex offenders, and to emphasize the church's necessary role in shaping, through prophetic teaching, a climate of opinion in which civil authorities could prevent vice and immorality. The second impulse behind Luther's family ethic was his rejection of celibacy as unbiblical and unnatural. Luther's critics have seen him here as a failed celibate, a man unable to control his lusts. Luther blamed the doctrine of celibacy itself. His attention to the book of Genesis was key here. For Luther, God's words in Genesis 1:28, "Be fruitful and multiply," represented more than a command. They were what he called a divine ordinance, Werk in German, which it is not our prerogative to hinder or ignore. Addressing the Teutonic Knights, the Reformer emphasized Genesis 2:18. "It is not good that man should be alone. I will make him a helper who shall be with him." Setting himself squarely against the papacy and the church councils here, Luther declared, "Whoever would be a true Christian must grant that the saying of God is true, and believe that God was not drunk when he spoke these words and instituted marriage." Luther's always good with his little things in there. God was not drunk. Except among those rare persons, not more than 1 in 1,000, Luther said at one point, who received true celibacy as a gift from God, marriage and procreation were divinely ordained. Quote, "For it is not a matter of free choice or decision, but a natural and necessary thing." A natural and necessary thing. That whatever is a man must have a woman, and whatever is a woman must have a man. The intentionally celibate adult had no warrant from God. Indeed, Luther added, they cannot boast that what they do is pleasing in God's sight, as can the woman in childbirth, even if her child is born out of wedlock. This unusual praise for the unwed mother underscores Luther's belief in the necessary and valued role of human fertility. Indeed, beyond a ritualistic nod to the fallen state of humankind, Luther saw sex as natural and, in the right circumstances, good, something purposefully linked to procreation and God's will. He appealed directly here to Der Kreaturen, humanity's created physical nature, a work of God that was mightier than all the words, thoughts, and dreams of all men and devils. Before the fall, when Adam and Eve were expelled from Eden, Luther held that women would not only have given birth without pain, but their fertility would have also been far greater, a true and pure abundance of children. But even after the fall, the sexual urge remained in service to God's will. Now, Luther was quite aware of the potential complications here. For example, he responded to the pleas of a healthy man married to an invalid wife, unable to perform what was called the conjugal duty. Could he be allowed to commit adultery? No, Luther said, for God is far too faithful to deprive you of your wife through illness, without at the same time subduing your carnal desire, if you will but faithfully serve your invalid wife. Regarding the sexual act, Luther acknowledged that intercourse was never without sin. However, God excuses it by his grace because the estate of marriage is his work, and he preserves in and through the sin all the good which he has implanted and blessed in marriage. Through marriage, sex became a moral good, an expression of God's will. This was the heart of Luther's sexual revolution. While occasionally acknowledging in unenthusiastic fashion St. Paul's defense of the single life, Luther was far more comfortable with the social order he described in his pamphlet, Exhortation to the Knights of the Teutonic Order. And I quote, "We were all created to do as our parents have done, to beget and rear children. This is a duty which God has laid upon us, commanded and implanted in us, as is proved by our bodily members, our daily emotions, and the example of all mankind." Marriage with the expectation of children, in Luther's view, represented the natural and normal form of worldly existence. Not only was this institution affirmed by Scripture, as he wrote, "Marriage has been from the beginning and still is free and honorable, even among the heathen and throughout the world." In this sense, it was a natural and necessary institution, found even where there was no gospel being preached. It was an expression of the created order. Marital fertility was also a spiritual expression. Luther saw procreation as the very essence of the human life in Eden before the fall. As he wrote, "Truly in all nature, there was no activity more excellent and more admirable than procreation. After the proclamation of the name of God, it is the most important activity Adam and Eve in the state of innocence could carry on, as free from sin in doing this as they were in praising God." The fall of Adam and Eve into sin interrupted this pure, exuberant fertility. Even so, the German reformer praised each conception of a new child as an act of wonderment, wholly beyond our understanding, a miracle bearing the lovely music of nature, a faint reminder of life before the fall. He continued, this living together of husband and wife, that they occupy the same home, that they take care of the household, that they produce and bring up children, is a kind of faint image and a remnant, as it were, of that blessed living together in Eden. What a wonderful portrait of the Christian home. In marriage, humans found a taste of Eden. Procreation, too, was in Luther's words a most outstanding gift. Indeed, he called it the greatest work of God. Accordingly, Luther sharply criticized the contraceptive or birth control mentality that was alive and well in his own time. He noted that this inhuman attitude, which is worse than barbarous, was found chiefly among the well-born, the nobility and princes. Elsewhere, he linked contraception and abortion to selfishness. How great, therefore, the wickedness of fallen human nature is. How many girls there are who prevent conception and kill and expel tender fetuses, although procreation is the work of God. Indeed, some spouses who marry and live together have various ends in mind, but rarely children. Luther also understood that marriage was the best protection against the scourge of sexual disease. He wrote, the estate of marriage redounds to the benefit not alone of the body, property, honor, and soul of an individual, but also to the benefit of whole cities and countries, in that they remain exempt from the most terrible plagues that have befallen lands and people because of fornication. The third element in Luther's evangelical family ethic was his concept of a divine call to the vocations of husbandry and housewifery, to fatherhood and motherhood. Emphasizing human frailty, Luther argued that a successful marriage and a fulfilling family life were exceedingly difficult to attain if ungrounded in religious faith. In such cases, the delights of marriage, that husband and wife cherish one another, become one, serve one another, these would be commonly overshadowed by the responsibilities, duties, and attendant loss of freedom that the marriage state entailed. Hypothetically quoting that clever harlot, natural reason, that was Luther's label for the wisdom of the world, Luther parodied the popular attitudes of his day. Alas, must I rock the baby, wash its diapers, make its bed, smell its stench, stay up nights with it, take care of it when it cries, heal its rashes and sores, and on top of that, care for my wife, provide for her, labor at my trade, take care of this, take care of that? What? Should I make such a prisoner of myself? It is better to remain free and lead a peaceful, carefree life. I will become a priest or a nun and compel my children to do likewise. Luther believed that happiness in marriage depended on recognition that the married estate, with all of its attendant responsibilities, was pleasing to God and precious in his sight. Indeed, women were called by God to be mothers. Quote, a woman is not created to be a virgin, but to conceive and bear children. Similarly, God called men home to serve as Christian house fathers. In a wonderful passage, Luther described the father who confesses to God, I am not worthy to rock the little babe, or wash its diapers, or to be entrusted with the care of the child and its mother. Luther goes on to assure him that when a father goes ahead and washes diapers for his child, God with all of his angels and creatures is smiling, because he is doing so in Christian faith. Luther says that in the commandment, honor thy father and mother, we see that God has done marriage the honor of putting it immediately after the honor due to himself. The Reformer concludes that there is no higher office, state, condition, or work than the estate of marriage. Marriage was, in fact, the real religious order on earth, in that the risks of marriage impelled men and women to the most inward and highest of spiritual states, to faith. In harmony with this, Luther also cast man and woman as fully equal in dignity and authority, with their marital union a true partnership of work, procreation, and childcare. As he wrote in his commentary on Genesis, whatever the husband has, this the wife has and possesses in its entirety. Their partnership involves not only their means, but children, food, bed, and dwelling. Their purposes, too, are the same. The result is that the husband differs from the wife in no other respect than in sex. Otherwise, the woman is altogether as the man. If the wife is honorable, virtuous, and pious, she shares in all the cares, endeavors, duties, and functions of her husband. In short, Luther's sexual egalitarianism could be expressed only through the bond of marriage, where husband and wife, in becoming one flesh, found true equality. And Luther lived his words. In a famous declaration, the Reformer condemned the common late medieval practice of putting the estate of a deceased male only in the hands of another male trustee. Instead, Luther's last will and testament made his wife Catherine heir to everything and directed his children to abide by her decisions as long as she lived. Fourth, Luther elevated parenting as a task and responsibility. In so doing, he energized the Christian home as an autonomous social sphere. He wrote, "There is no power on earth that is nobler or greater than that of parents. Most certainly, father and mother are apostles, bishops, and priests to their children, for it is they who make them acquainted with the gospel." Luther's disciple, Justus Menius, explained the task of parenting in more detail. "The diligent rearing of children is the greatest service to the world, both in spiritual and temporal affairs, both for the present life and for posterity. Just as one turns young calves into strong cows and oxen, rears young colts to be brave stallions, and nurtures small tender shoots into great fruit-bearing trees, so must we bring up children to be knowing and courageous adults who serve both land and people and help both to prosper." According to the Harvard University historian Stephen Osment, in his surprising book, which I highly recommend, entitled "When Fathers Ruled, Family Life in Reformation Europe," as he wrote there, "Never has the art of parenting been more highly praised and parental authority more wholeheartedly supported than in Reformation Europe. Nowhere else. Never." Child-rearing was not simply woman's work. In the Protestant home, father and mother would share the duties of child-rearing to an unusual degree. Luther saw the years from birth to age 6 as a time when a child's reason was asleep. During these years, the mother took the dominant role in child care. But at age 7, fathers should take the lead, with special responsibility for the moral and practical education of children. Inspired by Luther's message and example, publishers of the time turned out dozens of editions of the so-called Housefather books, 16th century self-help volumes for dads. The goal was to instill in children the internal controls necessary to an ordered life, a balance of temperament, a willed self-control, and a conformity between internal character and external behavior. On the negative side, Luther condemned men who deserted their families or failed to provide support for their children. Such men were, in his words, monsters of nature. Finally, Luther's family ethic rested on his understanding of Christian freedom. While surely a staunch moralist, Luther nonetheless rejected ecclesiastical legalism in favor of responsible Christian liberty. Often asked to comment on one or another existing church rule governing marriage or sexuality, Luther commonly fell back on St. Paul's words, "No one rules over his own body." By this he meant that Christians must abide by probity, by modesty, and must respect standards of decency. To put an end to the problem of secret marriages, Luther urged that parental permission for marriage be the expectation, thereby strengthening the role of the extended family. Beyond these principles, though, Luther tended to argue that within clear scriptural guidelines, personal freedom should be granted. Concerning conjugal rights, for example, he declared them fools who lay snares and laws in such matters. Yet, Luther consistently maintained that true Christian freedom from the law could never degenerate into idleness or wickedness. As he famously explained, faith alone is the righteousness of a Christian and the fulfilling of all the commandments. For he who fulfills the first commandment has no difficulty in fulfilling the rest. From this, Luther rejected most of the 18 impediments to marriage maintained by the Roman Catholic Church. As justification, he turned again to Scripture. Leviticus 18, he said, clearly stated that a man could not marry his mother, stepmother, sister, stepsister, a granddaughter or step-granddaughter, or an aunt. Yet the Reformer dismissed as unbiblical the Church's prohibitions on marriages to cousins, non-Christians, godparents and godchildren, the deaf and the blind, calling instead for greater freedom to marry. Marriage, he concluded, was not a sacrament, but an outward bodily thing like any other worldly undertaking. Referring to 1 Corinthians 7, he approved of a Christian's marriage to a non-believer, noting, "You will find plenty of Christians, indeed the greater part of them, who are worse in their secret unbelief than any Jew, heathen, Turk, or heretic." Now, in deference to current debates, though, I should note that Luther never extended this freedom to marry to two people of the same sex. For him, it is clear by implication that this would have been an inconceivable, horrific act, contrary to the very order of God's creation. Luther endorsed early marriage at age 20 for young men, age 17 or 18 for women, years when they are still in good health and best suited for marriage. In praising early marriage, he also urged young couples to not be overly concerned about financial security. Let God worry about how they and their children are to be fed. God makes children, he will surely also feed them. Moreover, Luther rejected an absolute ban on divorce. The words of Jesus in Matthew 19, he believed, clearly allowed for divorce in cases of adultery. Even so, he argued that only the innocent party could remarry. Luther even maintained in one commentary that, quote, government should still put adulterers to death, in the spirit of Deuteronomy 22. The only other grounds for divorce that he acknowledged were those cases where one spouse denied conjugal rights to the other, and extreme incompatibility. In the latter case, though, neither party might remarry. In short, while opening the door to divorce slightly, Luther was far removed from a modern no-fault stance. How then might we judge the success of Luther's family ethic? For nearly 4 centuries, it worked pretty well. Luther framed a family life that cast marriage as the highest order and calling on earth, softened and redirected while not eliminating patriarchal or father leadership, spiritually and culturally elevated motherhood and the building of homes, celebrated procreation and large families, encouraged greater home autonomy, and refocused adult lives around the tasks of childrearing. Luther's own marriage to Catherine von Bora, their 6 children, and their busy home became the model for generations of pastors to follow. These pastoral families in turn served as models of proper Christian living for their congregants. In these ways, Luther's family ethic successfully worked to reshape the broader culture, producing marriage-centered and family-centered societies in Germany, Northern Europe, and I would argue even here in the United States, or colonial America as well. Well, this Protestant culture of marriage lasted into the 20th century, but did not survive that century. What went wrong? Well, this is too large a question for me to answer fully in this talk. What I can do, though, is sketch out a few changes that undermined the Lutheran model. In the early 20th century, for example, the allure of birth control spread among Protestant pastors. One study found that average family size among pastors fell from 6.5 children in 1890 to 3.7 children by 1920, despite formal church condemnations of contraceptive practices. The change was noted by laymen and lay women. Later, the divorce revolution of the 1960s also swept through the Protestant churches, almost without opposition. The feminist challenge of the late 20th century, particularly in those Protestant churches which came to ordain women, struck a blow at the special status of pastor's wife, simultaneously crippling the role of pastor's family as a special model or guide. We're all individuals now. Family models don't matter. In short, instead of reshaping the broader culture, as during the 16th and 17th centuries, the Lutheran family of the 20th century was being restructured by the broader culture. Does contemporary Lutheranism have somewhere within it the moral and theological resources to become again a culture-changing institution in favor of the family? Well, I believe that it does. Its components or specifics would include casting marriage and the bearing and rearing of children as the highest order, estate, or calling on earth. Framing patriarchal leadership, male headship, to focus on the protection and encouragement of women as wives and mothers, and on responsibility for the Christian formation and education of children. Elevating motherhood, both spiritually and culturally. Casting the home as the center for both religious and economic life, a busy place rich in functions, with models ranging from the woman described in Proverbs 31 to the busy household managed by Catherine von Bora Luther. Celebrating procreation in large families is pleasing to God and precious in His sight, and is a gift by the married couple to the greater society and commonwealth. It's important to stress, though, that these are not old-fashioned ideas any longer. Rather, they are the way forward. Indeed, I believe they are the future if humankind is to have a future. And so with that, I offer an opportunity again for comments or questions. Yes, sir.
So yeah, they have changed in some regard, and culture has changed in some regard, but people are still the same. Would you agree?
Yes. People are the same. The problems are pretty much the same. The challenges are pretty much the same. The model of how we are to live, what our nature is, was laid out in Genesis 1 and 2. That's still about 80% of what you need to know. The New Testament amplified and explained it a little further, in some ways elevated marriage even further than Genesis 1 and 2 did, which already put it at the center of creation. What's also clear, though, is that human failures, original sin if you prefer, our constant ability to screw it up, no matter how good it gets, complacency sets in, laziness sets in. We look upon the great efforts of our ancestors, say, to build a family-centered society and say, well, that was okay for them. Well, what fools. We're smarter now. We know more. We can do it better. We can get it right this time. The Israelis may have worshipped Baal, but they didn't do it very well. We'll do it better this time. We'll get it all right. That same story never ends. When I did this book, which I mentioned, I believe, Family Cycles, periods of strengthening of family life in America followed by periods of decline. I explained it once to a biblical scholar. It was a woman, the thesis, and she says, oh, that's just the Old Testament. The Israelis. They're faithful, they're worshiping, they go to temple, they're doing everything that they're supposed to do. And they put up an idol, and a little bit of more divorce, and everything will be good. We just need a little bit more freedom. And within about a generation or two, everything's gone. Place is a shambles. God punishes them, and along come a couple of prophets, and the whole process starts over again. Probably in our human existence, we're condemned to that until the end times, when everything is set straight. But nothing changes. It's just where we are in the cycle and what our calling is. The expectation that Luther saw never changes. That's always constant. How well we respond to it changes as a society, both individually, but particularly as a society, is always changing. Things are getting better or things are getting worse. But they're rarely the same. They're rarely stable.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm sorry, may I? Just two more, and I promise not to say anything else. There were two things. There was one thing that I found very interesting and really kind of shocked by. And so by your research, have you also come across this? A couple of years ago, a man named Eric Metaxas wrote a book. I think he's a historian. He wrote a book.
Name called? Name?
Eric Metaxas. Are you familiar with him? Okay. He wrote a book, I think it's entitled The Life of Luther. And when I read the book, I was shocked by this. You know this to be true. In Luther's time, it was culturally acceptable that a newly married couple and their consummation must be witnessed by either family or friends or neighbors. Are you familiar with that? I was shocked by that.
I don't think that's true.
Okay.
The very concept of secret marriage, in fact, rejects that. The church believed in the secret marriage. That was okay, which was not only, even the vows, even the promises, even the engagement were kept secret. So I don't think that was true.
I found that I was just shocked by that. I thought, how can this be?
I don't
And
think that was
secondly,
true.
you also mentioned.
Although I will say this, though, true. It was true, for example, even among the Puritans, for example, who are known as staunch moralists. But, at the time of a wedding, there was oftentimes the husband and wife would be taken to a home, to a place. They would go upstairs, and the party would continue down below. That was not uncommon. It's called a chivalry sometimes, was one of the words to use to describe it. But those kind of customs survive. But to my knowledge, that's not true.
Very good. The last comment, if I may. You mentioned the book that was written by the Harvard professor regarding Reformation era fatherhood. What was the name of that book, please?
When Fathers Ruled. And the
Thank you.
professor is Osmond. Professor, what's his first name? Let me look again. Stephen, that's right, Stephen, S-T-E-V-E-N, Stephen Osmond, When Fathers Ruled, Family Life in Reformation Europe. Actually came from Harvard University Press. And like I say, it's a wonderful book. Right? I highly recommend it. Even the historian was surprised at how thorough and again, forward-looking Luther was. If Harvard says that, it must be true, right? Okay. Any other questions? Oh, yes, right here.
Well, I'd rather go with what Ecclesiastes says rather than Harvard, in that what has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done, and there is nothing new under the sun.
What do you mean by that, then, do you think?
Well, okay, I'll read the next verse. Is there a thing of which it is said, see, this is new? It has already been in the ages before us. So from
I think that supports what I said, doesn't it?
it is.
I think it does.
Yes. And
Thank you, that's good, that's very helpful. Up here I saw a question, yeah.
I just like the title of the presentation. The thought of husband and wife and family being God's gift and God's most direct and supreme gift to mankind, and how that has gotten lost and convoluted in American culture and all the other things that can take your attention from that. So grounding in that gift, I think, is a supreme mentality for the Christian home to have and to value. And I think that gets lost in this culture very easily and needs to be more of a forefront within the church in what they preach and talk about and stand on, as opposed to just something in the periphery that I think it's a central gift, and I like that was the title of your talk. So not really a question, just a...
Well, let me just add on to that. I think one of the problems, and just I'm thinking of my own experience, but I've looked into books. I mean, I go to theological libraries and just kind of prowl around in the section on marriage and family and stuff to see what was coming out as devotional books on guidance on Christian marriage and family. And even back in the books from the 1950s, when everything seemed to be going pretty well, the marriage rate was high, the birth rate was high, but I would say the Christian books that were being written were astonishingly bland, poor. Marriage was kind of a duty, but there was no sense of excitement. There was no sense of, this is something really great. And you've got emptiness in your soul, or you're unhappy about a lot of things. Here's answers. Here are answers. You're lost. most of these books were just not good. And again, it's reflected on what I call kind of the complacency that sets in, particularly when things are going well. The sense of excitement, the sense of energy, the power of such ideas to renew lives and build homes that are rich and terrific and great. I'll even use a specific example of what went wrong there. We'll call home economics. Something I've looked at too, the rise and fall of the home economics movement. The original premise behind that was to preserve and protect and encourage the home as a functional place, where the skills of the past, making of clothing, preparation of food, raising a garden, child care, the things would be reconciled with modern insights and new things that have come along, like washing machines and toasters and so on. The original premise was really good, and the original home economists were trying again to preserve and protect the home as an autonomous sphere, where things and productive things and good things were still happening, which was a busy place. What happened by the 1940s and 50s, though, is that whole discipline had been pretty much taken over by the corporations. And home economics was teaching women how to be good consumers. It was teaching them how to buy. As one of the home economists, her name was Christine Frederick, very famous and influential figure in the 1930s and 40s. It says, women are no longer cooks, we are now can openers. And she meant that seriously as a positive change. We're no longer cooks, we're can openers. We open the can, throw it, maybe heat it up on the stove, and that's it. There's your meal. But the original idea was the home as a center of, again, of life, of energy, of productive activity, of things, of busyness. The wonderful portrait of Luther's home. A very busy place with all kinds of people coming and going, lots of entertaining. Catherine von Bora was running a brewery along the side just to kind of deal with all the beer needs of the Luther family. On and on through the list. But it was a home you wanted to visit. It's a place you'd like to go see. Like to feel the energy that's flowing through it. All that was lost in home economics. And by the time the discipline died, literally died around 1970, feminists just almost didn't even have to attack it. They just had to give it a little shove, and it collapsed. There are no more home economics departments anymore. The older women here were mandated they had to go to home economics class back at the 50s and 60s. Those are all gone now, and probably for the best, given what they were teaching by that time. Again, it was how to be a good consumer. Again, that's a modern example of how things decay and fall apart. You lose sight of what's really supposed to be happening, and you wind up adopting something easy. And you forget the great energy that had gone into building successful homes in the past, and you say, well, we can do it now, but we're so much smarter than they were. We can do it better. And we don't have to abide by all those old standards and those old rules. Those were silly. That's how things fall apart. Other questions? Yes?
This might be, I don't know, oversimplifying or overgeneralizing, but would you say that the survival of the United States under its constitutional form is dependent on a return to the natural family and a lot of the things that you've talked about today?
Absolutely. I mean, absolutely. Well, we see what the alternative is. I mean, one of the things the family does is a strong family system solves all kinds of problems. Who's going to care for the very young, the very old, the sick? How will productive resources be shared by those who produce and create or make an income, so to speak, and those who cannot or are unable to do so? How is a sense of continuity, cultural continuity to be maintained, a sense of history and of the past and of the future? families do that. They do it extremely well. When families fail, governments try to step in. Sometimes they push their way in, and the result is disaster in the long run. So absolutely.
So just to follow up, I think what I've heard is you're bullish on the prospects of that. Is that true? Would you say
Well, I
that
think
there's
it's the only way forward. I'm trying to be bullish and optimistic, and I think it will happen. Now, it may be that we Christians won't be able to pull it off. And I say this, I mentioned this to another person already. The Muslims are doing a much better job of holding their family system together than we are. And they're doing a much better job of projecting it around the globe. That should be we should be ashamed of us for letting that happen. My organization has worked, as I mentioned to one of you here earlier, we maintain a presence at the United Nations. We're an official NGO there, and we have delegates that go to the meetings that deal with sex, marriage, and family, which is a lot of what the UN does these days, and all kinds of bad ideas are flowing around in there. And mostly we're just trying to stop them, although some positive things have happened. My main point, though, is that the only reliable voting bloc in defense of preborn life and the only reliable vote in favor of defending family as an autonomous freestanding institution comes from the Organization of Islamic Conference. The so-called Christian nations, even ones who know better, don't do very well. Occasionally they vote the right way. But it's kind of an indictment of I would call it the failure of the churches, of Christian civilization to understand what's important. And I'll just leave it at that. Yes.
Family also inherently, if not forces, sacrifice and sharing and humility. So just the mindset of a family is so different than the mindset that can happen if you don't have a family, because it just forces that sacrificial nature and that nature of charity and doing things for other people, which needs to be fostered in this culture of me, and selfishness, and how can I get ahead, and all that kind of stuff.
I agree, very well said. And of course, I think the deeper meaning, if Genesis 1 and 2 is indeed an accurate account of what God intended to do in the creation, which I think it is, the very central role of creation, which is what I tried to explain in my earlier talk, is focused on family, marriage and family. And when we move away from that, or try to move away from that, and to become a group of self-defining individuals, reject marriage, which is in fact very common these days, or find no way to get to marriage, which I think is just as common. I'm sure the pastor here could comment, but at least I've known many young people who desperately want to get married, but have not figured out a way to find a spouse that shares their enthusiasm. I almost want to set up a camp somewhere that can meet each other. A young adult camp, maybe that's being done somewhere. But when that falls apart, the creation becomes disordered. Nothing works. Everything falls apart. Yes. Yes.
Just a question. So you talked about it in the opening of Genesis, the story kind of opens with a wedding, and then go forth and multiply. As we get into the New Testament, there's the Great Commission, and the Bible sort of ends with a marriage motif as well. How do you grapple with the apparent tension between these marriage motifs and multiplying, and then the Pauline sort of discussion on singleness for the sake of the gospel? Because I see often a lot of younger people, especially the ones who can't get married or can't find somebody who is as excited, they kind of fall back. Well, maybe then that's me. Maybe I'm meant to be single for the sake of the gospel? Like, how as a Christian or as a Christian community are we to kind of look between the marriage, command and motif, and then as well as Paul's direction as far as like it's be better to be single?
It's a good question. I think part of the answer is, first of all, I deeply sympathize with the kind of young people you're talking about who are looking for a way forward. Like I say, many times want to be married, but are finding it one reason or another. And again, the culture is anti-marriage in so many ways, finding it very difficult. With that said, how do you deal with the apostles? And in fact, relatively little attention paid to the family status of the apostles. And with Paul, we know the celebrate. I think the answer, at least the answer that I have, I don't know, I'm not sure what Luther said about that, but is that was a special time. That was a unique time. Jesus came. And for a period of time, we'll take it a generation or so, the general rules don't apply. The Son of God has come to earth. The fall has been overcome. The kingdom of God is now clear, is going to be coming back to us. So I was the apostles, the original apostles, and Paul, they were doing a special job. But that job ended at some point at the end of the apostolic era. Let's just to make it easy, whatever that was, maybe 100 AD or so. That job ended, and then I think that's how a commission came back into force. So that's how I'd answer that question. That was a unique time. And just leave it at that. Any other questions? Yeah. Oh.
Sort of a two-pronged question. I'll ask them both at the same time because they're very much related. What do you see, what would you like to see, is maybe a better way to state this, Christian congregations and Christian pastors being more direct in preaching and teaching on these subjects? And then related to that, in the Christian home, what should Christian fathers and mothers be doing perhaps to a greater degree, or what things should they stress that maybe are assumed right now, in your opinion?
Well, in my opinion, excitement has to be brought back into the story. And I've seen it done. I wish I mentioned the World Congress of Families. We actually just held a big one down in Mexico City about a month ago, and 9,000 people came. It was quite an event. There was a presentation in what's his name? He's Roman Catholic. And he and a couple of other guys put on this show. I was thinking, no, this is not going to be very good. These guys are showmen. He even had a guitar, which is, to me, everything's wrong with the guitar. But he had a guitar, and he did some singing. But I have to say, that was one of the finest presentations about what marriage and life and conception, what it all meant and how it all tied together. I was kind of rolled over by it. It was designed for young people. And I have to say, wow. I rarely say wow to things like that. This was really good. And again, it put energy into it. It made, well, for example, at one point, he brought up a young man from the audience and asked him when he was born. And he gave the date, and he said, oh, let's go back 9 months before that, when you were conceived. He says, yeah. He says, I actually have a picture of that, when it happened. And so he put up a picture of sperm coming into an egg. And then went on from that about what a remarkable miracle that was. And how all kinds of things followed from that. Again, it was an exciting presentation that made marriage and sexuality really great. That has to be done. I can't do that. I'm a historian. I tend to dwell on the past, try to find lessons there, though. But that's the kind of thing that needs to be done. And again, so many of the books that were, even books during the good years, the 50s and 60s, they're kind of turgid, they're kind of boring, and they don't capture the excitement of Christian marriage and family life. Earlier, someone mentioned the ministry of Doug Wilson up in Idaho. They're doing some pretty interesting stuff up there on this message, very much so as well. That's a model for how I think other traditions, other parts of the Christian community could do things. And you got to make it exciting, because it is. An escape from I think the tendency to fall back on, well, this is what you should do. This is your responsibility. It is, but boy, don't that's not the lead message. That's not the lead message. You've got an opportunity to do something great and exciting. And here it is. So that's a general statement, but it can be done. Again, like I say, this fellow at the Congress I was just bowled over by the whole thing. Yes.
I'd like to pick on one statement that you meant about, or maybe quoted Luther from, of saying how marriage is the highest calling on earth. And the excitement you speak of is Christ telling us that as Christ loves his church. And that is just so full of beauty and mystery that the family is based on that reality within the marriage. And I see somewhat, even since where I've been matured from as a child, that the previous generation held the marriage and the spouse in such high regard that the children learn from the love of the parents as the source of carrying on the procreation process. I see a lot of current things seem to have switched to the children of the family rather than the parents and what bonds them in Christ and the model of Christ and his bride, the church. So there isn't a question really in that, except maybe, do you see a ramification currently of emphasis going towards the children, which is, to me, a product of maybe what you mentioned as the divorce movement of 1960. When a marriage fails, then the children kind of become important, or the focus.
Is there a question, or just, I agree with your comments. Well, yes. I mean, when a culture is healthy, the message is, how do I put it this way? A healthy culture, which in my experience tend to last just a few generations usually till the sloth comes in. But the message is just taught by the general behavior that you watch and see. And my wife and I were married in 1972, a year after we graduated from college. That was the last year, really. There's reasons why I say that statistic. It was the last year where the old marriage culture was still around. And I knew when I went to college, I had one thing, a key thing I was supposed to do was find somebody to get married, find a good girl and marry her. That was what going to a Christian college meant. And that's, in my view, that's the only reason to have Christian colleges outside of maybe the training of church workers. It was a Lutheran college. I went to Augustana College in Rock Island. And it was still kind of a Lutheran college then. Well, again, I won't go into what's happened to it, but it was back then. And why did the college exist? Well, I'll put it quite bluntly. It was a place where Swedish Lutheran boys would go to meet Swedish American Lutheran girls and create more little Swedish American Lutherans. And that's okay. That's what they're for. That's really what they were for. That's what they should be for. I've taught at Hillsdale College for a while, and it was just a great opportunity. They still do that there, although it's so much more generic. It's where conservative boys go to meet conservative girls to marry and have little conservative children. That's kind of what Hillsdale's mission is. It's not written down, but that's why, in a way, that's why it exists. And that's the way it should be. And the broader culture in 1972 still taught you get married in your early 20s, late teens, early 20s. And a lot of people were getting married at age 18 and 19. If you still had an average first age of marriage of 20, a lot of 18 and 19-year-olds were getting married right out of high school. And that was my experience. A lot of my high school friends got married right away. The culture delivered the message, that's what you're supposed to do. And it gave you a life script to follow. And then you went off, you got your college degree, you started having children, and then you started build a career and so on. But the home was always central, it was the first focus. Get the marriage going, get the family going, and then worry about building your career. And women, of course, were still home economists, or at least presumed to be home economists. But like I said, that whole training was collapsing right before our eyes, and for valid reasons. It had become corrupt. But by the mid-1970s, this life script had been thrown out. And I guess that's another thing to say, giving young people a life script is important. I think it's something else pastors can do. They're lost souls, partly because they don't know what they're supposed to do. They're taught many different things. Get a career. One of the reasons marriage occurs so late is that, well, don't get married until you've got your career established, you got your graduate education done, and this and that and whatnot. Well, by that time, 18 may be too early to get married, but I think 21 is a pretty good number. When you get in your 30s and 40s, you can still build a good marriage. And but you're also, a lot of people aren't going to get married. You're just too set in your ways. It's difficult. It's more difficult to getting married at age 20 or 21 when you can kind of mold each other around each other. But that expectation of early marriage obviously is no longer there. In fact, quite to the contrary, people are shocked. Well, they're just 20 and 21. They're getting married? That used to be the norm. Not so long ago. But life scripts are important. Giving young people a life script that not only makes sense, but has an excitement built into it, as well as I think a spiritual component. Finding ways to help do that. I'm wandering off your question, but anyway, I hope that's helpful. Another one here?
Obviously the culture in America has shifted. So as Christians, just generally speaking, what role do you see Christians should have in the public or civic sphere in regard to things like, since the Obergefell decision and current bills that are going on in Congress and things that are happening in the local school districts and all this kind of things? Like, obviously we have our own households where we have say and we have authority, but in the broader culture, where do you see Christians being able to step in that realm?
Well, it's a complicated question. On the one hand, I wouldn't entirely give up on public policy as a protective force. The deterioration, though, of marriage law at this point is pretty extreme. Pretty well, our American legal system regarding marriage is kind of a disaster right now. And just this week, there was another vote in the Senate regarding, was it the Respect for Marriage Act or something? Well, it's just one more nail in the coffin of the old marriage system, I think at best. It wasn't that big a deal because what's left of marriage legally is quite meager. So what should Christians do? Well, I think build fresh institutions in terms of education of children. Unless you're extremely lucky, I'm going to say the public schools just don't do it. You have to find another alternative. Homeschools, great believer in homeschools, homeschool co-ops, hybrids, Christian schools. I mean, the Lutheran school system, was at one time, the Missouri Synod and the Wisconsin Synod was a glorious thing at one time. It's kind of fallen on hard times in recent decades. But if refocused and re-energized, it could be strong again and very helpful. Although, to be frank, the religious schools that seem to be best able to hold on to the faith and to the truths about these things are those that avoid tying themselves to an ecclesiastical structure. In the town of Rockford, the Catholic diocese schools are not much better than the public schools in most respects, but there's a number of independent Catholic Christian schools. One near where I live, Our Lady of the Sacred Heart Academy, which is Catholic, but it's completely independent of the hierarchy. And that's a good place to be usually. When things are corrupted, stay away from the hierarchies. Bishops have to make political decisions, and they make compromises all the time. Stay away from them. Build new schools, educate the children. I have to say, I've been a little pleasantly surprised that the argument for religious liberty is holding up as well as it is in the Supreme Court. And that did result from a conscious effort by the Federalist Society and many others to feed into the Supreme Court good justices. And they're there now. And religious liberty is now a kind of a trump card. I don't mean that Trump as a capital T, but a trump card. But in some ways, Trump contributed to it. One of the good things he did was get a couple of good justices in there. But religious liberty is now being protected, and I think it will be until the court personnel changes. But that could be some decades down the road. So protection of religious liberty is good, but you've got to build your own institutions, re-energize ones that are able to be re-energized. Engage in public policy. That's hard right now. Neither political party does very well on family issues. I mean, people think the Republican Party is the pro-family party. Well, sort of, a little bit more maybe than the Democrats, but not a whole lot more. I'd like to see a new party emerge. I know that how impossible that may seem to be, but I think we're at a moment where we need a political party. Problem with the Republicans, I vote Republican by and large, but with my nose like this, you put the Republicans in office, they still tend to favor the corporations, favor the Pentagon, and favor the big banks. And they really give very little attention to the family. Now, the Democrats attack the family, so there's some ways there's a small difference there, but we need a much more coherent and organized political pro-family movement. So, stay in that game. Support religious liberty. Like I say, right now that's the shelter for independent schools, and I think ultimately for families. Even mentioned teaching at Hillsdale. Hillsdale made a decision a few years ago that it's a conservative school. It's a fine conservative school, but it was not technically a church school. It had no religious affiliation. And its purpose statement had no language in it. But they changed their constitution. They're still not affiliated with any church body, but their constitution makes it very clear now they're a Christian institution resting on certain Christian principles. And they did that because to protect them when they're challenged for example, on policies dealing with marriage and so on. If they have a religious component to their purpose, they have a legal standing to protect themselves, where they wouldn't just as a quote-unquote secular conservative institution. I don't know if that's helpful. I hope so. Yes, sir.
One aspect of this discussion has been the people have controlled their number of births a lot of times due to financial restrictions. They say, oh, I'll have 2 or 3, only because I can only afford. I don't send them to parochial school or religious schools because I get taxed on the public side. The key to the financial and to the parochial school would be school vouchers, so that if they're going to give money to the person or to the school of where the kid's supposed to go, would be a fairer statement, and that would eliminate or improve the financial condition and then the educational process. And then we get back onto it. The sacrifice that a lot of parents are going through these days gets back to having the goal of this and that, and they don't want to go that 100% sacrifice to the child and say, okay, go to the parochial school and we'll sacrifice everything. And that becomes a burden at times. And if we could eliminate that or mitigate it, I think we would have a big foothold in this fight.
A couple of comments on that. On the one hand, vouchers, in theory, always sound great. They carry 2 dangers, one of which I think you just cited, is that you become dependent, if church schools become dependent on public money, they quickly lose the ability to support themselves and quickly get lazy. Stop raising money, stop calling for sacrifices on the part of parents, and down the road, the government's going to come up with some new requirements and new regulations. Well, if you're going to keep this money coming, you're going to have to make this change or adapt this new policy. Always a danger, and you're right, at that point then, it's no longer really an independent institution. But there is another policy, which I strongly favor, and it makes for strange political bedfellows. It was mentioned, I think it was mentioned in the introduction, that I was a member of the National Commission on Children. I was appointed by President Reagan. It was a freestanding commission created by Congress in 1988. 36 members, 12 appointed by the President, 12 by the Speaker of the House, and 12 by the President of the Senate. 2-to-1 Democratic majority. But kind of through a small public policy miracle, the final report of that commission was really quite good. Its central recommendation was to create a new child tax credit of $1,000 per child and make it universal. That was one of the things I was pushing for in there. I'm strongly in favor of tax benefits to families with children at home. First of all, I think just theoretically it makes sense. When couples are raising children at home and going through the expenses, cut their taxes on a per capita, per child basis. You avoid almost all of the problems that go with a voucher at that point. And you're not even specified. Nobody does the extra money they're getting or keeping, and that's the key point. They're keeping more money of what they earned when they're raising children. What that means over the lifetime is that when they get older and don't have children in the home anymore, their tax rate will go up. But that's, I think, a good way to use taxes and tax policy. It avoids the opening the family up to all kinds of regulations and so on. I'll tell you, though, how strange it gets relative to the public policy question. I'm strongly in favor of the child tax credit. We recommended it in 91 in our so-called final report. It was adopted in 96 under President Clinton. In fact, Bill Clinton was a member of the Commission on Children when he was governor of Arkansas then. But under Clinton, we got the $600 tax credit. Under George Bush, number 2, it became $1,000. And then recently, during the COVID thing, the child tax credit was expanded. And for a while, it was $3,000 per child. I was entirely in favor of that. Then it went back. And in fact, to some degree, the Republican Party pushed to end that number. They wanted to push it back down. I think it's now around 2,000, back down to close to 2,000. But I have to say, strange bedfellows, when the recent, you may not like me after you hear this, but I'm going to say a good thing about Bernie Sanders. During the recent debate over the big congressional bill, the climate change bill, all that whole thing that was going through this past summer, when they were debating that, the bill did not restore. They'd cut out the high tax credit again. It just eliminated it. It's part of the dealing that was going on. A bad thing, in my opinion. During the debate, Bernie Sanders proposed an amendment to the bill to raise the child tax credit back up to $3,000, expand its availability, and in order to pay for that, he proposed raising the tax rate on the biggest corporations, like Google, like Facebook, like Amazon, and so on. On that day, on that bill, on that issue, Bernie Sanders was exactly right. You know how many votes he got supporting him? 0. It was turned down. 1 vote in favor, 99 against, which shows you, I think, again, the priority levels that you find within Congress among both parties. So I will put on that day, he was my hero. Now, other days, he's not my hero. But he did the right thing. So tax credits, tax relief for families, that's what we do. We don't pit it to any specific thing like education. Because I agree, dependence on government money corrupts institutions. It's corrupted the Christian hospitals, by and large, which used to be wonderful places supported by Christian donations, but the money is just sloshed in. And the Lutheran hospital is not much different from the Masonic hospital. I mean, they're all just sort of the same because the government makes them that way. The government money makes them that way. Any other questions?
Actually, more of a comment than anything else. In my opinion, since the teachers' unions have a great deal of public persuasion, and we are somewhat slaves to the government schools. They're not taxpayer schools, they're government schools, but of course we subsidize them. Being a taxpayer, 70% of real estate tax goes to support the public school. So, my opinion, we should detach ourselves from paying property taxes that support an institution that is anti-family. I mean, and I think if that was to be discussed in all honesty by the Republican Party, they would have a lot of support with that, but I'm afraid that the union has a great deal of persuasion, and we are kind of a losing battle, I'm afraid, but my point is that it would be a great idea for taxpayers to say, well, we have enough of this now. We would not go in the store and buy something that we wouldn't want. Why are we paying for something that we shouldn't have? Just a thought.
Well, I agree. But as we all know, it's sort of like trying to get rid of student loans. The public schools are so deeply entrenched, just like federal aid to higher education is so deeply entrenched, it's almost hard to escape. I signed on long ago, a friend of mine, he's since deceased, but he started an organization called the American Organization for the Separation of School and State. And I still think was a great idea, it still is. But how we escape from the overwhelming pressure of the unions and the fear of Republican politicians, for reasons I don't entirely understand, why they don't see the opportunity here. They do. They do. Again, I still mostly vote Republican, but it's with little hope of seeing any great changes. Something's going to have to burgeon up from the bottom up, something along the lines of the original Republican Party burgeoning up on the ruins of the old Whig Party in the context of the slavery controversy. We may be approaching that kind of a crisis again. We'll know. Okay, any other questions? I guess I think we're 12:30. It's time to probably move on to other aspects of our lives, huh?
Join me in thanking Dr. Carlson for his time today. In closing, here at St. John, we typically end our educational chances and opportunities and pretty much every meeting and Bible class with the Lord's Prayer, so let's end our time together with the Lord's Prayer this day. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. Thank you all for coming out today. Stay warm and be safe as you head back home. And God be with you this weekend.